Hello, and welcome to the On Books podcast. My name is Chris, and this week on the show, I am bringing you 21 Lessons for the 21st Century. This is a book by Yuval Noah Harari. It came out in 2018. It's about 350 pages, and it is one of my favorite books of the past few years. In this episode, I will be bringing you some highlights from the book, help you to understand not only what it's about, but maybe guide you to some of the more important parts, and then, hopefully get you to decide either whether you want to read it or if this was enough. If you feel like you kind of got a good summary, you can go from there. So that's kind of my goal. I'm just really excited to do a little bit of readings from it and share some of the highlights. So let's jump right into it. It's likely that you've heard Yuval Noah Harari's name before. He became pretty famous for his first book, Sapiens. So there was Sapiens, which came out a few years ago, and then Homo Deus, which was his second book, and this book, 21 Lessons for the 21st Century. These three books are, I would say, part of a trilogy, right? They each kind of have a theme and they build on top of each other. A question that I get is, do you need to read the first two books in order to read this book? Not at all. If anything, this book, 21 Lessons for the 21st Century, kind of builds on or really just highlights a lot of the arguments in those books. So this is the perfect book if you're only going to read one, I would say, for just kind of highlighting the main arguments. And the book itself, 21 Lessons, it's broken into, surprise, 21 chapters, each which has a theme, different topics about work, community, religion. We'll go into this in a little bit more in depth, but I do think it's helpful to understand where we're coming from in the trilogy of these books so that you can kind of have some context in understanding where this goes. So the first thing which is important to know about Sapiens was a book that he wrote about the history of humanity. So it's about the past. It's about how we as humans really became the dominant animal on the planet, right? Out of all of the different, things on the planet, why are we endowed with this, to be gods, on the planet, making the rules and controlling all of the other species? But Sapiens, the book, is fascinating. It really opened my eyes to just how the world works, to be honest, because what Yuval Noah Harari does in that book is he comes to this observation that the thing which really distinguishes humans from other species, it's not the thumb, right? It's not what you think it is. It's not iPods. Well, not really. It's iPods, iPhones. What century is this? Lost in history. But what the thing is it's storytelling is what he comes down to. Storytelling, in the way that Harari explains it, is our ability as humans to weave together common myths, right? Our ability to tell stories and to create trust and cooperation with millions of people, right? As people who are strangers, people that we don't even know, right? I mean, if you think of the way that that wolves or ants or different kinds of animals work together, they work together in packs, they work together locally, but we've been able to create stories like a mythical story such as the Bible that has been able to bring together people, not only, in Rome, not only in certain parts of the world, but over time, right? And to bring together people around such stories as Christianity is one he cites, capitalism, right? We trust that our money is going to be worth something. All of these are different stories, is what Harari calls it, in the book Sapiens, that really has brought together the power of humanity. So that's Sapiens, looking at the past. Homo Deus, now the second book, Homo Deus looks into the future. So again, with Sapiens, if we are looking at how you and me, how we went from once being insignificant apes to these people who are controlling the planet, right, through storytelling, right? That was kind of our trajectory of getting here. Looking into the future, Yuval Noah Harari says that the stories that we are spinning right now are stories that are us trying to make ourselves into gods, with the Homo Deus becoming this human man, this God man is basically what the idea is there. And so what he's looking at there is the different kinds of the breakdown in the stories of the past and the new stories that are replacing that. And just kind of like highlight a few. And again, this will all kind of come into the new book in a second, but just to highlight a few, he talks about ideas of humanism, the idea that the human, it's a story that we tell that like basically the human animal is the most divine and important animal on the planet, and everything can really just perish on the planet. We can kill animals, we can kill the planet, we can kill trees, but as long as the human species is surviving, this is a story, right? And that really struck me to hear that, because in some ways, I do think that like a life that's well lived is a story that I tell myself is just like eating well and taking care of myself and helping other people and getting a good education, right? Like these are just the ideas of what I think a good human life is. But he tells it in such a way that really kind of shook me up a little bit, that that's just a story, right? That's like, it's such a subjective view on reality to think that there's any kind of like way that some entity called a human that is me in this moment should live. And I think some better part of myself like kind of understands that, but 99% of the things I do every day are just really focusing on being a good human. I mean, if I'm being honest, like, that's what it's about. And it's interesting to see my choices through this idea of humanism. A few examples of the way this carries out in society is, humanism is like, the voter knows best, right? Democracy should rule the world. We should choose everything. The customer is always right? Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Think for yourself. I'm trying to think of just all of these things in society that are pointing at us to say like we are in control. And this comes back to this idea of homo deus, of we are gods, right? We are making ourselves the most important thing. Okay, so to summarize how we get to this most recent book, Sapiens is about the past, about how humans became the dominant animal through stories. Homo Deus is about the future, about how our stories are coming undone and we're having new stories that are crafting us as gods. These are big, sweeping ideas, right? And my guess is that, Yuval Noah Harari in writing these books and getting a lot of acclaim for them, realized, what? There's a lot of people out there who are probably like walking through the airport and just want a book that tells them some relevant things that they can apply this to. You know what I mean? You just want, like, a lot of people just kind of want to know, what do I do with all this stuff, right? Because those books are very philosophical, right? And I definitely enjoy that kind of stuff. But yeah, even myself, sometimes it's hard to kind of imagine how to apply those stories. And so I feel like this book, 21 Lessons, is that application. It is about the present, right? So Sapiens is the past, Homo Deus is the future. 21 Lessons now is about the present. And so he's taking these ideas, and a lot of the ideas are similar, which is why I'm saying you could just start with this book. And he's basically taking a lot of these principles that I just described and applying them. So let's jump into it. I'm going to start with a short reading from the introduction to the book. Okay, introduction from 21 Lessons. In a world deluged by irrelevant information, clarity is power. In theory, anyone can join the debate on the future of humanity, but it's so hard to maintain a clear vision. Frequently, we don't even notice that a debate is going on, or what the key questions are. Billions of us can hardly afford the luxury of investigating, because we have more pressing things to do. We have to go to work, take care of the kids, or look after elderly parents. Unfortunately, history gives no discounts. If the future of humanity is decided in your absence because you're too busy feeding and clothing your kids, you and they will not be exempt from the consequences. This is very unfair. But who said history was fair? Ooh, right? Gives you chills a little bit. So, strong opening right out the beginning of the book. And where it goes from here is he jumps pretty quickly into these 21 chapters. Given everything that I've told you about storytelling and how our stories are breaking down, our stories of the past, stories like religion, stories like nationalism and capitalism, and we're having new stories that we're telling. Right, each one of the chapters is kind of more or less meditation, I would say, like him applying these his rationalization and his logic and breaking apart the stories that are either breaking down or new stories that are coming into the zeitgeist of our mind and society. And that's what we have here. I'll read a few off so you can kind of get an idea of where this is going. So stories about work, that chapter is about you might not have a job because the story that we tell ourselves about work over the past few decades, centuries, is changing dramatically. And it talks a lot about AI and universal basic income. Stories about nationalism, nationalism versus globalism, stories about religion. There's a great quote that I love. It says, more than a century after Nietzsche pronounced God dead, God seems to be making a comeback. But this is a mirage. God is dead. It's just taking a while to get rid of the body. It talks about religion. It talks about war. So the stories and the future of war. And then at the end, there's 3 chapters, and we'll get to this as well, on what we can be doing. So the positivity of how through these stories we can get some clarity through education, through meditation, through getting through the clutter of this. So I would say that's a big theme. If you haven't caught that already, it's clarity. It's the idea that there are these stories and being able to observe which ones are working for you and for the world and which ones aren't helps. I would say this book, one of the key things that it did for me is helps give me a little clarity of how these stories overlap and influence each other, and just how to have more clarity about them in my own life. I would say another theme, in addition to clarity, is he talks a lot about the shortcomings of the liberal worldview. The liberal worldview, being this humanistic eye view, being this democratic view of the world, basically the status quo of the world as we know it today. And he takes a lot of shots at some of the shortcomings in that. And he says let me see if I have it right here. It's right in the beginning of the book. He talks about it. He says that liberalism is in a jam. And much of the book discusses the shortcomings of the liberal worldview and of the democratic system. And he does so not because he believes that the liberal democracy is uniquely problematic, but rather that it's the most successful and versatile political model humans have so far developed with dealing with the challenges of the world. So I guess his thing that he's upset about, or that he's raising attention to, I would say, is that we take a lot of these things for granted, and sometimes we can't see it, that we're blind to our own, the idea of that we're like fish in water and we can't see the water because we are just used to seeing it. And so I'd say that's another kind of theme of this book would be, for the first would be clarity, and the second would be having us to see this shortcomings of the liberal worldview, and he goes into that chapter over chapter. I'm going to read now from the first chapter, which is called Disillusionment. So let's go a little bit deeper and understanding what's going on here in this book. Let's read from the first chapter, and then I'm going to read one from a chapter towards the end, and I'll also play a few audio clips too, so you could hear Yuval Noah Harari talking about some of these ideas as well. So that's what we have coming up. All right, sit back, ready? All right, here we go. This is from the first chapter. It's Disillusionment, and the end of history has been postponed is the subtitle there. All right. Humans think in stories rather than in facts, numbers, or equations, and the simpler the story, the better. Every person, group, and nation has its own tales and myths. But during the 20th century, the global elites in New York, London, Berlin, and Moscow formulated 3 grand stories that claim to explain the whole past and to predict the future of the entire world. There was, number 1, the fascist story. Number 2, the communist story. And number 3, the liberal story. fascism, communism, and liberalism. The Second World War knocked out the fascist story. And from the late 1940s to the late 1980s, the world became a battleground between just two stories: communism and liberalism. Then the communist story collapsed, and the liberal story remained the dominant guide to the human past and the indispensable manual for the future of the world. Or so it seemed to the global elite. So what we're talking about there, obviously, is the breakdown of the communist story. We're talking about the Cold War ending, more or less. So when the Cold War ended, now we're left with this one story, which he's calling the liberal story. And, we're just so happy about it is kind of the subtext there. We are ecstatic about liberalism is what he's getting at. And keep reading. The liberal story. The liberal story celebrates the value and power of liberty. It says that for thousands of years, humankind lived under oppressive regimes, which allowed people few political rights, economic opportunities, or personal liberties, and which heavily restricted the movement of individuals, ideas, and goods. That's the liberal story. But people fought for their freedom, and step by step, liberty, it did gain ground. Democratic regimes took the place of brutal dictatorships. Free enterprise overcame economic restrictions. People learned to think for themselves and follow their hearts, instead of blindly obeying bigoted priests and hidebound traditions. Open roads, stout bridges, and bustling airports replaced walls, moats, and barbed wire fences. I mean, yeah, just go to Berlin today, and you can still see the photos of what it was back before 1989, but it's a very liberal place nowadays. The liberal story acknowledges that not all is well in the world, and that there are still many hurdles to overcome. Much of our planet is dominated by tyrants, and even in the most liberal countries, many citizens suffer from poverty, violence, and oppression. But at least we know what we need to do in order to overcome these problems. What is that? Give people more liberty. We need to protect human rights, to grant everybody the vote, to establish free markets, and to let individuals, ideas, and goods move throughout the world as easily as possible. According to this liberal panacea, accepted in slight variations by George W. Bush, that is, Barack Obama, and everyone alike. If we just continue to liberalize and globalize our political and economic systems, we will produce peace. We will produce prosperity for all. That's the panacea, liberalism. Countries that join this unstoppable march of progress will be rewarded with peace and prosperity sooner. Countries that try to resist the inevitable will suffer the consequences until they too see the light, open their borders, and liberalize their societies, their politics, their markets. It may take some time, but eventually, even North Korea, Iraq, El Salvador, they're going to look like Denmark or Iowa. In the 1990s and 2000s, this story became a global mantra. Many governments from Brazil to India adopted liberal recipes in an attempt to join the inexorable march of history. Those failing to do so seemed like fossils from a bygone era. In 1997, the U.S. President Bill Clinton, confidently rebuked the Chinese government that its refusal to liberalize Chinese politics put it on the wrong side of history. However, since the global financial crisis of 2008, people all over the world have become increasingly disillusioned with the liberal story. I kind of read that weird. I'm going to reread that last sentence again. I don't know if you got it. Let me make sure you got this. However, since the global financial crisis of 2008, people all over the world have become increasingly disillusioned with the liberal story. Yeah, that was right. That feels good. Walls and firewalls are back in vogue. resistance to immigration and to trade agreements is mounting. Ostensibly, democratic governments undermine the independence of the judiciary system, restrict the freedom of the press, and portray any opposition as treason. Strongmen in countries like Turkey and Russia experiment with new types of illiberal democracies and downright dictatorships. Today, few would confidently declare that the Chinese Communist Party is on the wrong side of history. The year 2016, marked by the Brexit vote in Britain and by the rise of Donald Trump in the United States, signified the movement when this tidal wave of disillusionment reached the core liberal states of Western Europe and North America. Whereas a few years ago, American and Europeans were still trying to liberalize Iraq, liberalize Libya, at the point of gun, basically, many people in, Kentucky and Yorkshire have now come to see the liberal vision as either undesirable or unattainable. Some discovered a liking for the old hierarchical world, and they don't want to give up their racial, national, or gendered privileges. Others have concluded, rightly or wrongly, that liberalism and globalism are a huge racket, empowering a tiny elite at the expense of the masses. So, to summarize, he summarizes here, in 1983, humans were offered 3 stories to choose from. In 1968, just 2. And in 1998, in the late 90s, a single story seemed to prevail. Now, here we are in the late, 2020s, basically. We are later down the road, and we are down to 0. We have no stories. No wonder that the liberal elites who dominated much of the world in recent decades have entered a state of shock and disorientation. To have one story is the most reassuring situation of all. Everything's perfectly clear. To be suddenly left without any story is terrifying. All right. This chapter is called Disillusionment, as I said, and there's about 10 more pages in it. Just to kind of highlight and, summarize some of what's going on here is, we as humans rose to power again because of our ability to tell stories. And the one story which we were globally exporting, right, from America all the way back to the Vietnam War and saying that, democracy and liberalism is right to wars every decade thereafter till today. This has been the idea: globalism, liberalism, and he is kind of exploring this idea that this story is now dying. This story is under attack, and the feeling that we have is disillusionment because we don't know where to go next. Throughout the next few chapters, he looks at like what he calls the technology challenge, right? Because as these stories are kind of eroding what we know of community and work and nationalism, right? We also have 3 really big challenges as a species that we are going to need to, everyone on the planet, get together and cooperate. We're all going to need to cooperate if we're going to really be able to work through these 3 things. So I'm going to list them here. Technological disruption, basically AI, artificial intelligence, and biotech, the technological ramifications and destruction that will come from that. Nuclear war and climate change. These are 3 of his main concerns. And I'm going to play a clip in just a second. I want to set it up here, but I'm going to play a clip where he goes into that and talks a little bit about it. The idea, to just kind of set it up for you, is that climate change, something like climate change, isn't something that any one nation can solve on its own. We need a story basically a way to unite nations across the world, right? So this is the idea. And he feels similarly about some of the troubling consequences if any one country becomes all-powerful in AI or nuclear war, etc. I'm going to play a clip now with Yuval Noah Harari on Sam Harris's podcast talking about his concerns and this breakdown of stories.
We need, for a number of reasons, to develop global identities, a global loyalty, a loyalty to the whole of humankind and to the whole of planet Earth.
So this is a story that becomes so captivating that it supersedes other stories that seem to say Team
not
America.
Abolishes them. I don't think we need to abolish all nations and cultures and languages and just become this homogeneous gray goo all over the planet. No, you can have several identities and loyalties at the same time. People already do it now. They had it throughout history. I can be loyal to my family, to my neighborhood, to my profession, to my city, and to my nation at the same time. And sometimes there are conflicts, say between my loyalty to my business and my loyalty to my family. So I need to think hard. Sometimes I prefer the interest of the family. Sometimes I prefer the interest of the business. So that's life. We have these difficulties in life. It's not always easy. So I'm not saying let's abolish all other identities, and from now on we are just citizens of the world. But we can add this kind of layer of loyalty to the previous layers. And this, people have been talking about it for thousands of years. But now it really becomes a necessity, because we are now facing 3 global problems, which are the most important problems of humankind, and it should be obvious to everybody that they can only be solved on a global level, through global cooperation.
Right.
These are nuclear war, climate change, and technological disruption. It should be obvious to anybody that you can't solve climate change on a national level. You can't build a wall against rising temperatures or rising sea levels. No country, even United States or China, no country is ecologically independent. There are no longer independent countries in the world if you look at it from an ecological perspective.
Right.
Similarly, when it comes to technological disruptions, the potential dangers of artificial intelligence and biotechnology should be obvious to everybody. You cannot regulate artificial intelligence on a national level. If there is some technological development you're afraid of, like developing autonomous weapon systems, or like doing genetic engineering on human babies, then if you want to regulate this, you need cooperation with other countries, because like the ecology, also science and technology, they are global. They don't belong to any one country or any one government. So if, for example, the United States bans genetic engineering on human beings, it won't prevent the Chinese or the Koreans or the Russians from doing it. And then a few years down the line, if the Chinese are starting to produce superhumans by the thousands, the Americans wouldn't like to stay behind. So they will break their own ban. The only way to prevent a very dangerous arms race in the fields of AI and biotechnology is through global cooperation. Now, it's going to be very difficult, but I don't think it's impossible. I actually gain a lot of hope from seeing the strength of nationalism.
Because okay, so that's totally counterintuitive, because everything you just said, in the space provided, there's only one noun that solves the problem, which is world government on some level.
No, we don't need a single emperor or government. You can have good cooperation even without a single emperor.
Then we need some other tools by which to cooperate, because we have, in a world that is as politically fragmented as ours, into nation states, all of which have their domestic political concerns and their short time horizons. So you're talking about global problems and long-term problems that can only be solved through global cooperation and long-term thinking.
Yeah.
And we have political systems that are insular and focused on time horizons that don't exceed 4 or, in the best case, 6 years.
Yeah.
And then we have the occasional semi-benevolent dictatorship that can play the game slightly differently. So what is the solution if not just a fusing of political apparatus at some point in the future?
No, we certainly need to go beyond the national level to a level when we have real trust between different countries. Of the kind you see, for example, still in the European Union. If you take the example of having a ban on developing autonomous weapon systems. So if the Chinese and the Americans today try to sign an agreement banning killer robots, The big problem there is trust. How do you really trust the other side to live up to the agreement? AI is in this sense much worse than nuclear weapons, because with nuclear weapons, it's very difficult to develop nuclear weapons in complete secrecy. People are going to notice. But with AI, there are all kinds of things you can do in secret. And the big question is, how can we trust them? And at present, there is no way that the Chinese and the Americans, for example, are really going to be able to trust one another. Even if they sign an agreement, every side will say, yes, we are good guys, we don't want to do it, but how can we really be sure that they are not doing it? So we have to do it first. But if you think about, for example, France and Germany, despite the terrible history of these two countries, a much worse history than the history of the relations between China and the US, if today the Germans come to the French and they tell the French, trust us, we don't have some secret laboratory in the Bavarian Alps where we develop killer robots in order to conquer France, the French will believe them. And the French have good reason to believe them. They are really trustworthy in this. And if the French and Germans manage to reach this situation, I think it's not hopeless also for the Chinese and the Americans.
If you'd like to hear more of this conversation between Yuval Noah Harari and Sam Harris, you can find it on the Sam Harris podcast. That was episode 138 on the Making Sense podcast. You can check that out. I'm going to wrap up this book going forward towards one of the last chapters where he starts to talk about, I would say, less about the stories that we're telling and in this kind of disillusion, and more towards what you as a person reading the book, or thinking or concerned about, just this, we have so much information and there's so many things to pay attention to. How do you get clarity? He breaks it down into really two main themes. Education, so staying educated, and a talk here about how to educate your children, or how to educate the next generation, and meditation, so how to clear your mind. Reading from the education chapter, he writes, in such a world, the last thing a teacher needs is to give her pupils more information. They already have far too much of it. Instead, people need the ability to make sense of information, to tell the difference between what is important and what is unimportant, and above all, to combine the many bits of information into a broader picture of the world. And, I would say that is really what this book is trying to do. He is trying, in as few pages as possible, to really break down these big complex ideas into almost like the BuzzFeed of the history of humanity. By that I mean it's like 21. It's this list of these are important things where you can place your time and energy and stay educated to try to see that they are just stories, and if you haven't read the book, or if that's not fully landing, I think that some of this language that I'm using, he really does deliver it in such a way that it makes sense. Well, I hope you enjoyed this episode of 21 Lessons for the 21st Century by Yuval Noah Harari. If you would like, you can listen to the Sapiens episode I have, and many other episodes of the On Books podcast, which are all on iTunes or Spotify or YouTube. You can just search On Books podcast and you'll find Sapiens, you'll find Mating in Captivity, Letters to a Young Poet, lots of my favorite books that are really just like life enriching and changing books is really one of the themes. And just books that I'm really passionate about and I'm excited to read from and share with you. So check that out. If you have any questions for me, or you want to suggest something, possibly suggest a future book, you can email me at chris@on-books.com. I'd love to know what you think of the show, how I can make it better. Anything like that is always useful. You can always rate the podcast. That's like the one thing that's really helpful, giving it 5 stars on iTunes, and tell a friend. That kind of stuff also helps as well. So those are the final things in closing. And this is always fun to make. We don't have any sponsors. It's just a show that I do just because it's enjoyable and because a lot of people write me and ask me to make more, and I'm happy to do it. So thanks for listening, and enjoy your day. And hopefully you get to read any of these books from Yuval Noah Harari. I'll put the show notes and everything on my blog, which is at castig.org. You can check that out. All right, enjoy.